I'm Anne-Marie McCardle, and this is the Wave Breathwork Podcast, where we explore breathwork, consciousness, and readily available ways to work with your energy and physiology for meaningful change. So today we're going to be talking about the science and the experience of conscious connected breathwork and circular breathwork. So what does breathwork actually do to the brain and the body? And I'm really excited for today's guest. I'm joined by Dr. Martha Havenith. And Martha is a neuroscientist trained at Oxford University, the Max Planck Institute and University College London. And she is one of the world's leading researchers on conscious connected breathwork. She's an author, an incredible breathwork facilitator, space holder, and an educator who runs her own breathwork training school Into the Deep, where she's mainly training in the medical and psychotherapy fields. So super lucky to have Martha with us today. Fáilte Martha. So yeah, I was saying, I remember the very first time that I heard you, I was watching a YouTube video from the Mind Foundation, and literally 2 weeks later you popped up in this Bird of Breath collective. I was like, yeah, I get to learn more from your beautiful brain. So thank you so much for coming on today, because I know you're super busy, magical multitasker that you are. Just for the clarity for listeners
Absolute
today,
pleasure.
I would absolutely love to focus on circular breathwork, because in this podcast we will be talking about lots of different kinds of breathwork, but today specifically, this is what I would love to chat about. So we're going to start with like a nice easy question, because I know you've recently written a book which is super fantastic. So if you could just define breathwork, there's a nice easy one for you, just define breathwork in as simple in terms of breaking it down for listeners between circular breathing, which we're going to be talking about today, and the difference between this and all of the many other forms that are in existence.
Right, yes. That's such a good point. So I think if we want to kind of keep it a bit simple and not go, because there's so many beautiful techniques, right, to use with breathwork. But if we want to keep it a bit simple, we could say that breathwork in general is basically changing your breath in any way whatsoever, in a conscious way, to enhance well-being, right? That might be mental or physical or both. And I would say that there's sort of three big branches that you can look at. One is sort of more slow breathing based, right? Which is a lot of the time more for relaxation, right? For general regulation, mental well-being. Then you have the techniques that are more geared towards fitness, towards physical benefits. Those are, funny enough, often sort of a mix of things, right? So it can be a little bit of fast breathing, a little bit of slow breathing, so a bit of more of a dynamic range. And then you have the techniques that I would call circular breath work. The reason we felt the need to come up with one more new word about breath work is because that's actually quite a few different schools, right? Like holotropic, rebirthing, conscious connected. There's a lot of different schools. Soma breath also belongs to that. So that all employ a similar breathing pattern where you're really intensifying your breath, right? So you breathe deep and typically also a little bit faster than usual. And those are typically more geared towards, yes, they have physical benefits, surely. Yes, they can also relax you, but a lot of the time they're geared more towards opening up altered states of consciousness, opening up non-ordinary ways of experiencing your own inner world and, the world around you.
So you did it so succinct to be able to to cover the whole gamut. Because I think this is really confusing for people, though. I'm finding as a facilitator that this, you'll see like a pranayama session is being advertised as breath work, and then somebody's coming with the expectation that it's going to take them into the altered state of consciousness. So that's why I just want a little bit of clarity around that, because it is turning into this massive bridge term versus the definitions that people who are in the field might know. And I think often when you're in the field, you can forget what it's like when you're not in the field and you're trying to decipher what is what.
Absolutely. And I think we're just now at the stage where we're realizing, that, different breathwork practitioners also have to talk to each other more to define the field better. Because I think that's one of the big obstacles to breathwork, reaching even more people, is that, it looks a little bit like a jungle. You would have to do your research. And then also people sometimes end up sort of in sessions they hadn't intended, right? So you might think, oh, breathwork, that sounds like a nice little yoga thing. And then you end up in a full-blown circular breathwork session and go like, oh, people are screaming. I don't know what this is, right? So, right, and the other way around. So I think exactly like thinking about, the types of breathwork, and also, for example, some breathwork schools are more structured, right? You have more clear sort of themes, for example, instructions, and others are very, very open. Those kinds of things, starting to map that better so that people can really choose what's right for them. I think that'll be a really important step.
Yeah, beautiful. And I think your book does a tremendous job of clarity across the board, because I think it's perfect for somebody who has no intro into breathwork at all, but also perfect for like facilitators and trainers, and it's really, really, it's a beautiful book and a clear guide. I'll definitely put the links to this in the notes. So just to talk a little bit about how you got into, we're going to call it circular breathwork. So just to define, when we're speaking about this today, we're speaking about conscious connected breathwork, holotropic, and anything that involves the cyclical breath in a community, not necessarily always a community setting, but ideally in a supportive group. So if you could chat just a little bit about your personal experience. I know you have obviously your own personal experience. We all came here on a particular path. So just chatting a wee bit about how you got into the breathwork field.
Yeah, right. I mean, like so many people, I think, breathwork really came to me in my personal life. And also, I think very typically people don't start breathwork because, they're super, super happy and they are lacking one more hobby, right? A lot of the time it's, it's really that, you have things you need or want to work on, right? And so that was definitely also the case for me. So for me, what basically happened was that I had a not particularly easy childhood. And I had started working on this actually quite early. And, I'd done things like meditation and psychotherapy a little bit. And I studied psychology and, like different self-help things and so on. And all of that definitely helped. I'm not saying that didn't help. That was very useful to kind of map out what I'm working with in my own emotional landscape. But around the age of 30, I really hit a wall where I was starting to feel that my way of experiencing life wasn't changing very much. And then there was a point where, for whatever reason, I think if I had to guess, my subconscious system decided that I was safe enough at that point, right? I had a stable relationship, right? We were living in a place that, we had friends and we were supported. And I think my system decided to sort of unpack the baggage, and lots of really intense emotions came up. And at that point, I was basically clueless enough. Like, I was like, okay, none of the stuff that I know works, so I must try something new, right? And so at the time we were living in Holland, and thankfully there, first of all, psychedelics were legal at the time. Now they're not anymore, which is a bit of an interesting development. And also body-based practices were much more common because of that. I think there's a certain relation. And so I started doing psychedelic medicine journeys, and as a part of that, often also breathwork sessions as preparation and as integration. And I immediately felt that it shifted so much more, right? And it really brought things up from a place of experience rather than cognitive understanding. I felt like so many things in my system were healing in a different way from before. And so then basically from that point, I also really realized that, breathwork on its own is doing a lot, right? The medicine journeys were doing a lot, but breathwork on its own is so powerful. And obviously you can bring it anywhere, unlike other things, right? And that's really where I felt that I want to also support other people in breathwork journeys, and I also want to kind of help make these practices more accessible to people who may also find them helpful, but, who maybe are a little bit afraid of very esoteric things, right? Who need a different kind of access point to these practices.
I think that's what's so beautiful when you're saying that, is that the difference between breathwork and psychedelics is you're in complete control, right? So if it becomes too intense, right, or any of these things happen, you're in charge of your breath, you change gear, and this is why it is such a wonderful field to look into for people that might be helped in this way. So given that you're doing such tremendous work and all these exciting research projects, this is what I'd love the listeners to hear a little bit more about this. How does this click in with you then? First of all, as a facilitator who is also a neuroscientist, how much of just speaking to your experience as a breathwork facilitator, do you kind of switch off a little bit this mode of how you say the logic of it all and just going into the experience? Is this a topic that comes up for you a lot?
Oh, that's a super interesting question. I think in a way these two worlds work much better together than one might have thought at the start, right? Or also I might have thought. I mean, for example, one of the things we know from neuroscience is that our nonverbal, partially probably also subconscious processing is incredibly powerful and often actually more correct than our verbal conscious processing, right? So in that sense, I think facilitation is a lot about switching off the sort of very verbal part of yourself and going more into direct process, right? Into, sensation and, the feel for the body of yourself and of the client and so on, right? And in a way that actually does exactly what you would expect from neuroscience, right? Which is that it increases your capacity to notice things if you don't think about them too much. So in that way, I think actually trusting your intuition in the correct setting is actually an incredibly rational and scientifically backed thing to do. Right? And so also, I think the other way around, so I now also do real neuroscience research into breathwork, and I think having the experience as a facilitator is very, very helpful in order to understand what it even is, what are the experiences that we're trying to put into numbers in a respectful way, right? Because ultimately, numbers are a language just like anything else, right? Just like, paint for a painter, right? Words for a poet. Numbers are a language, you have to use it carefully as a scientist. And knowing exactly the experiences that we want to describe this way is very, very helpful.
Yeah, that's a beautiful, beautiful way to put it. It's like put both hands together. This is the beauty, isn't it? It's like it's not like one thing or the other. And I have such an interest in physiology, and I really find this as a facilitator as well. It is so helpful when you can speak to different viewpoints too, just as a facilitator, because so many different viewpoints on what's actually happening. And if you see it as I love the question about the woo-woo. This comes up like often in the breathwork field, like, is it woo-woo? And I'm like, it's all of the things. It can be like woo-woo, or it can be like super physiological and scientifically explained, but it's really lovely. So I'd love to go into the scientific explanation like a little bit more. So if you could just chat from your point of view from studies about what it is so far that you've discovered. I also would like you to get a little speculative as well, because I think there's so much fun in the speculation. But if you just chat what you find, specifically around CO2 in your super famous study, now I see it popping up everywhere, because people are so excited to have actual tangible things. I think that's the beauty of the work that you do and are continuing to do, is you're going to bring it into the space that's going to let it spread more, which is why I get so excited about your work and talking to you. So just chat a little bit more about this and what you've discovered.
Yeah, right. So that study, actually, I get why you say it's exciting, because I had the same thing, right? When we were starting to get the data, I was like, I don't know what's going to come out, right? It might be that breathwork is just about, like the music and the setting and people just kind of going into their own little world, or it could be a physiological thing. And, I'm really curious what's going to come out. So I'm really glad that we're starting to find out a little bit more about that. And so what we did in that particular study was that we had experienced breathwork practitioners, because we did have to annoy them a couple of times throughout the session, and obviously that's difficult for beginners. And so what we did was we asked them every sort of 15 to 20 minutes, how deep is your experience right now? And they gave us a little rating with their hands. And then also we let them breathe into this little tube that can measure your CO2, like the out breath, the CO2 in your out breath. And so what we found with that, what we really wanted to know was, is it about the breathing, the physiological exchange of, CO2 and O2, or is it really about, the setting and the people around and the sharing and the music and all of those things, right? And what we found is that as you start breathing more actively, of course, CO2 levels go down, and because you're breathing out CO2, right, constantly, so you have less CO2 in your body than usually, which, by the way, then changes your blood pH. So your blood pH becomes less sour, more alkaline, because the ratio of O2 and CO2 changes. And so as the CO2 levels go down, what you notice is that the intensity of altered states of consciousness starts going up. But then, and there is also a relationship. So if you breathe a bit more strongly, you get more CO2 out of your system, you're generally more likely to have deep breathwork experiences. That's not one-to-one, but it does really seem to help to really get your CO2 down, especially at the start of the session. But then, as CO2 returns to normal throughout the session, you can see that the altered states of consciousness, the deep experiences keep going for a while. So it doesn't seem to be that, you constantly have to breathe out CO2 in order to stay in a breathwork state. It's more that at least lowering your CO2 once strongly enough seems to be like a door opener that makes it much easier to go into deep breathwork experiences.
Yeah, I am obsessed with CO2. It's like it's so but it's so interesting in every breath. Like no matter what school of breath work or what technique, there is so much around CO2, and obviously everybody's always talking about O2. And I know you've probably spoken a little bit to Martin McPhillimy, because I've spoken to him about you myself, but he would always talk about pH as the state of consciousness, and I love this rabbit hole, because there's obviously something there. So just kind of chatting about your thoughts on this altered states of consciousness and what you're finding there. Do you think, like, obviously there's many other things that you can explore, but do you think that it's possible to say that CO2 is there another way you could flip the study and it'd be like, oh, it's actually nothing to do with the CO2? Does that make sense as a question? Obviously I'm not a neuroscientist, so I have no idea.
Right. So I think one of the nice things about this was that we had a control group who was doing everything as the same, right? They were part of the sharing, they were lying down, they were listening to the music, right? They were, welcome to express if there was something coming up, but they were asked to breathe normally, right? That was the one change. And with those participants, what we saw is that there's still a little bit of an experience, but it's very, very much smaller, right? So that really means that the breath is your tool to go into those breathwork states, right? It's not enough to just kind of experience something just in your mind. Your body is really helping you to go into those breathwork states. And it also seems pretty clear that it's definitely not just, for example, oxygen, right? So the oxygen in your blood also goes up because you're breathing in a lot, but that also happens for a lot of other circumstances where people don't have, crazy subjective experiences. So it does seem that CO2 going down is doing something really, really interesting to the system. And in a way that makes sense, because what we know from, really, really old studies, actually really classical studies on, for example, hyperventilation, right, which is not the same as breathwork, but has very similar physiology, is that as you breathe out the CO2, your blood pH becomes more alkaline, and that, for example, constricts your blood vessels in general. It also engages your sympathetic system, so sort of what people usually call fight or flight, but basically activation, right? And interestingly, it does two different things in your brain. One is it constricts blood vessels, but not the same everywhere. So it especially constricts blood vessels sort of around your thinking, metacognitive brain, not so much around your survival and feeling brain. And also, because of the Bohr effect, which we can get into if we want to, it also means that even though there's more oxygen in the blood, the brain itself actually gets less oxygen. So the blood kind of keeps all the oxygen to itself and doesn't actually share it with the tissues. So that means that your brain definitely has a very different environment to work with than usually, right? Gets less blood, and the blood also doesn't necessarily share the oxygen. So there will definitely be less oxygen in your brain. That doesn't mean that that's a level that's dangerous, right? You're not about to faint or get super sick or whatever, but it's definitely a clear difference from normal functioning.
Yeah, because I remember listening, I think it was in one of the classes when you lecture on Spurred Breath Collective, and you had called it blood communism, and I was like, that's just the best term for the Bohr effect.
Exactly.
It's like it's so much better than describing the Bohr effect in a like more serious way. But in terms of that impact, if you could speak to a little bit, I'd read you talked about like happy fight or flight mode. If you talk a little bit with conscious connected breathwork and circular breathwork, how it is that you're in between both states, between sympathetic and parasympathetic. Do you think this is where the beautiful awe-like feeling moment comes from this? Yeah, is this what you think it is, or is there anything that you're studying that shows this?
That's really fun. Fun that you should mention this, because that's something we've really started working on kind of just now. Sort of to look at what the autonomic nervous system is doing in these kinds of states, right? And I think what we're noticing is that we already have a couple of data points from completely different ways of entering altered states of consciousness. One is with DMT and one is with virtual reality, actually, funny enough. But in both of those cases, what we see is that when both parts of the autonomic nervous system, so fight or flight and rest and digest, are sort of at the same time activated, that's usually the part where you're most likely to be in a really altered state of consciousness, right? And I think in a way, subjectively, we can relate to that, right? Because of a little bit what you said already, sort of, I'm really activated, I'm really awake, but also I'm relaxed. Right? So I'm not sleepy and I'm also not stressed or like working hard, right? I'm really both. And I think in breathwork, we can also see that already a little bit, because when, for example, you measure heart rate variability during a breathwork session, you see that it really goes up and down like super, super strongly, which means that sympathetic and parasympathetic system seem to be taking turns very fast and probably co-active also quite a bit of the time. We need more data for that. But I think also as breathwork practitioners, we often see that, right? That people who don't go into activity at all, who never really breathe strongly, might have experiences, but it's a little bit difficult. But people who work super hard, right, who like breathe super strongly and, just keep working on it, very often also don't really find the easiest entrance into the experience, right? Which is why often then as a facilitator, you would say, hey, you can go a bit gentler, right? And very often that's when things open up, right? So I think sort of, in practical experience, I think this tracks very much with how people experience sessions also.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Because would you say in regards to your study that when you're talking about CO2 obviously drops quite quickly, you can take 3 sighs and you're already changing your CO2 level. So you're not necessarily speaking from your study that it means you're going like really pushing hard. In fact, it's usually the opposite. When you meet everything with softness, this is actually when the doors open. Would you agree with this statement?
I would generally agree with that for sure. Like also as a practitioner, I think that's very much how I would see it. And that's also, I think, one of the reasons why, there's a clear difference between hyperventilation, for example, when you're panicking, right? Which doesn't bring up, any very nice or interesting experiences, strong breathing and breathwork, right? And one of the big differences is when you breathe deep, you're really expanding like your belly and your chest, right? And when you're expanding, especially your chest, there's these little nerves that register that and actually activate your parasympathetic system, right? So they tell you, look, we're getting air, we can relax, right? And I think, so for example, in hyperventilation, that's different because a lot of the time it's shallow, right? So you have all the activation without any of the relaxation. So I think that's already a little bit baked into the breathwork technique. The sort of, yes, let's be active, but let's also be relaxed. And we can support that even more as facilitators.
Absolutely. And I think that's a key for a lot of people. I'm sure it's been common for you as a facilitator that somebody might make the link into their anxiety because they'll maybe feel that at the beginning of a session. They'll make this link between, that's how I feel sometimes when something panicky is happening. But they understand the difference being the conscious control and the cortical control, and this is the magic to using your breath, So I get really excited when somebody shares that at the end because they see that, there's something I can work with within that, which is really, really lovely. And I know you absolutely love talking about pivotal mental states because I listen to you talk, and anytime anybody mentions it, you're like, let's go. Please speak about this a little bit because I'd read somebody speaking about psychedelic research recently where they said it's not about default mode network shutdown, but it's about chaos. And now they're being very specific within their study, and I want you to talk a little bit about default mode shutdown. I know it's like a topic that you're well informed on as well. So kind of speaking what you think around this and altered states of consciousness and how it is that we're accessing these deep emotions and memories and cognitive flow and all these things that I always still say the word magically change, but there's a magical element to all of it that you can't describe as a neuroscientist exactly all of it, but the bits that you can coherently describe.
Yeah, and I think also, yes, that's such a beautiful question actually. And I think also in many ways, finding out more about the neuronal mechanisms of all this basically just tells you how the magic happens, right? I think it doesn't make it less magical, it just tells you how the magic actually works, right? Which is very fun. Yeah, so pivotal mental states for me are like one of my favorite frameworks for understanding these kinds of states. And the idea is basically, so this was proposed by Ari Brower and Robin Carhart-Harris, I think in 2020 or 21. And the idea is basically that if you push your system into an unusual let's say context, that's really challenging, and that's like more than your brain can deal with in a way, right? So that can be something really difficult. It can, for example, be trauma, right? But it can also be something positive, like birth of your first child is one of those examples, right? Where you're like, I can't even understand what's happening right now. And it's a very happy version of, basically overloading your brain. But basically what seems to happen is that when you enter those states, your brain shifts gears. And this is definitely related to the serotonin system. So more serotonin signaling, but also different serotonin signaling. So different receptors. There's a whole bunch of serotonin receptors. Some are active a lot of the time. Some are only active sometimes. So also that balance shifts. So some of the serotonin receptors, that are usually not so active, like the 5-HT2A that's mentioned a lot in psychedelics, get more activated also. That may potentially be because we are in our brain releasing psychedelic substances, potentially, but that's absolutely not proven at all. So when people say, oh, this is, for example, DMT breathing, that could be, but there's absolutely no proof yet that that's the thing, but it could be. So once your serotonin system shifts gears and, starts signaling very strongly and via different receptors, what seems to be happening is that, first of all, you filter less what comes in, right? Normally we filter out a lot of what we see and hear and sense. So the filtering becomes more flat, and also whatever comes in gets learned better, right? So through neural plasticity gets sort of burned into your brain more intensely. And what I like about that is that basically you can apply that both to situations that happen, in your everyday life or by accident, right? I'm sure you have moments where, let's say, for example, you have quite a shocking moment where, you almost get run over by a car or whatever. A lot of the time people will say, I saw that in slow motion and I still remember it exactly, right? Those kinds of things, right? So it really got burned into your brain. But it can also be practices that are entered voluntarily and where you kind of decide what is the context that I'm learning, right? What are the messages that are coming in when my brain opens up? And when we really think about that, a lot of the traditional spiritual practices are all about that, right? So let's say sweat lodges or ritual tattooing or, dervish dancing where people are, circling for hours, night watches, fasting, right? All of those things basically have in common that you give your system something that's very intense, kind of overwhelming, very unusual, but at the same time it's in the context of community and, alignment with spiritual values and all those kinds of things, right? So basically it's a way to open up those pivotal mental states. And what's interesting about this is it doesn't seem to matter so much what the unusual, overwhelming trigger is. You can use all sorts of triggers, and breathwork could be one of them. What's then interesting is that basically psychedelics seem to be using the same pathway, but just without an external trigger, but they seem to be using the same signal pathways as all these different other ways of opening up pivotal mental states.
And then this is giving you, as the breather in the case of breath work, the chance to come back into that moment that was seared into your brain and maybe your body decided for safety now is not the time to look at it. Is this the way that you're kind of looking at how we get into that space of working with some of the things that may potentially hold us back from flow?
I think that could definitely be one of the ways. So basically you can imagine that if your filtering of what you're experiencing becomes weaker, then whatever is under the surface has a chance to come up into your consciousness, right? And that can, for example, be connection to previous traumatic experiences. But I think it's also always important to mention that there can also be very positive things, right? So, for example, I think a lot of the time I've seen a lot of clients say, oh, I'm much more, loving, powerful, energetic than I thought, right? I didn't feel that in myself before, right? So that also when you remove filters, you can also see a lot of really cool things about yourself and about your life, right?
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, this is, I think, probably why it's why I share it. I'm sure it's a big factor for you as well. It's that change of it's just lifting the veil from feeling your own power and your own, things. Even for me, having a conversation like this 10 years ago, I'd been no way, just using my voice and things like this. And then after a few years of breath work, was well, sure, that's all, why not? There's no reason to be free. So that's definitely why I share it. Just chatting a little bit about where you kind of want to play with the research next. I know there's so many, you obviously have many different roles that you play in your life, but what would be your dream direction that you would like to take it in?
Yeah, so as you say, there's a lot of super interesting directions for sure. For example, right now the work that we've just started with the autonomic nervous system, I think that's really interesting because I think when we talk about neuroscience and explanations, so often it's, the brain. But the autonomic nervous system is basically one of the beautiful ways in which, we experience our body and, our life, basically. And so I think that's really interesting sort of in the short term. One of the things that I really love to look at in the long term is actually community interaction in breathwork, right? So interaction with facilitators, interaction with other participants, because my personal experience is that that's so powerful, right? And I think there are these things that you can feel very easily. For example, someone touches you and you're like, oh, that's not right for me right now. Or someone touches you, maybe even the same touch, and you're like, oh, that feels really like they're tuned in, right? Like that, that's really part of my process. So there's something that we can easily feel, but that has not been put into words or into numbers or anything. And so it always sounds really fuzzy and esoteric and so on. But I don't think it is, because pretty much all participants or all humans can feel these things. Like, is there a connection that works, or is there a connection that's not working, right? So I would love to look more at those dynamics and really understand what are the helpful dynamics that we can contribute, for example, as facilitators, that are maybe not so easy to put into words.
And are you speaking about this mostly in regards to like areas of the body that correlate to help and facilitate somebody's journey and body work within this framework? Is that what you're speaking of here?
I think it would be really interesting to look at individual dynamics, because, we know that, any touch, for example, to different body areas can be great for one person in one session and then terrible for another person in another session, right? So there must be a dynamic of reading each other's body language, for example, right? There must be a tuning in, right? There's also these experiments, for example, where you can put where you can get EEG recordings from two people at the same time, right? So in this case, for example, a facilitator and the client, and see how they work together. Do they synchronize, right? Do they respond to each other? So those kinds of things, where you have a look at what does this tuning in that we can all feel actually mean, right? On a physiological, on a neuronal level.
Oh, that would be so exciting to see that, because I would really like Carolyn Miss would talk about what intuitive area of the body links to which problem that comes up, and then you have like obviously Reich and Bell's attention. You have many people that have mapped out different areas of the body, but it's like you said, how do you actually read it within a session about, does this serve this person, which kind of leads me on a little bit to what I would just love to hear your opinion on. Obviously the breathwork field is exploding in many different ways, and it's very unregulated, and you see all sorts of different things. I'm kind of hoping for listeners listening to people like yourself talk, who are so experienced, what is it somebody should look out for? Yeah, it's like when you're going into the breathwork field, what is it you should be looking out for when you're going into circular breathwork, holotropic, conscious connected breathwork, that gives you an idea of trust with a facilitator? Because there's lots of very well-intended people, of course, but there's also lots of people facilitating sessions for, let's even just speak to people who hold them for 50 plus with one person in the room, just so people kind of understand the issues around that. Because for me, if I facilitate a pranayama class, 50 people together is lovely, yeah? If you're doing a particular kriya, this is beautiful, but this is completely different than when you're moving into such personal material that comes up in breathwork. So just if you could speak to this a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. I think this is so important, because indeed, this type of circular breathwork can be really powerful. That means powerfully healing, and it can also mean powerfully disturbing for someone's process, right? If it's not held well. So I think some of the first really obvious questions one can ask, you already mentioned one really important one: how many facilitators are there? Right? So, how many facilitators per participant, right? And I think a lot of the time people talk about, for example, boundary crossings, which are obviously a massive problem and should not happen, right? But I think what's sometimes talked about less is, what is the harm from not doing things, right? From not being supported, from not being available, right? Just because you're not doing anything and you're not, you're not there, doesn't mean that you're not causing a problem, right? So I think in our practice, the way we do it is we have a facilitators ratio of 1-4 approximately. I think some people can take that a little bit higher, 1-5, maybe 1-7, but that's already where I would be a little bit wondering if everyone can really get what they need. Yes. Right? So I think that's a massive factor, especially if you want to go deep. If you just want to go like very gentle, that's different. But if you want to really see how deep breathwork can go, you need facilitators if necessary, right? Another really important thing is preparation and integration, right? Does a facilitator leave time to kind of, already, for example, sharing other preparation practices to kind of go into an open mindset as you enter the breathwork session? And do they also leave space for integration? So, as you're landing from the breathwork session, to kind of figure out, what that means for you, how you can bring it into your everyday life. Do they, for example, offer extra support in case a session that was really challenging still, does things with you a couple of days later? That can absolutely happen. So really giving space for preparation and integration. That's easy to find out, so to speak. Another one is transparency. So really being open about how you work, what are the things you can offer, what are the situations you can work with, what are the things you cannot offer and you cannot work with. I think that's really important that facilitators make that clear. And if someone is fuzzy about that or, says, I can work with anyone and, this will be helpful for everyone, then I think that would be a red flag for me. Mm-hmm. And then I think the other one is, of course, just like with therapists, it's just a personal click that you have to feel. And then the final one that's, I think, the hardest to kind of prove in an obvious way is integrity, right? So, that facilitators really need to be clear about their own shortcomings and also, I think, need to be doing their own personal work consistently. Because I think there's always room to grow, and whatever you're not addressing in yourself will bleed into your clients' sessions, right? Yes. So I think that's a super, super important one, to feel if someone is taking on an approach of authority, or if they're clear on the fact that they are fallible humans who are, in this case, here to support you to the best of their ability.
Yes. Yeah, because there is a degree of, effort and work that is required there on like an ongoing basis. And I think this would be something that would be lovely to see kind of moving forward. Because for me, I certainly want to amplify like my voice, your voice, anybody that's speaking about breathwork, because it has such potential to help people, right? But do you see this moving into a more regulated, do you even think it is the place for it to be in this regulated healthcare system? Like, do you think this will happen? Like, what do you see this direction coming to pass when it's so unregulated? Mm-hmm. And you're, of course, going to provide all the studies that we all need for for this to occur. Total faith, Martha.
And thankfully by now, like a couple of like really good other people.
No, it's all on you. It's all on you.
I think that's a super interesting question for the next, let's say, 5 years or so. How are we going to move forward with that as a field? I think there's huge potential. And there's also like some little, traps that we should ideally avoid. So what I'm noticing now is because we've started working more with psychotherapists, right, and with sort of clinical contexts. And there is actually a real sort of translation necessary, right, between sort of the healthcare system and the language that's used and the sort of, ways of thinking that are used there and the type of language and thought that, breathwork facilitators would naturally bring in. And I think one of the biggest points there is how do you deal with risk, right? Because I think breathwork experiences are intense, right? And some of them are not very fun, so to speak, right? It's not like, right? So I think, for example, when we started with this, one of the things was, do we define crying as an adverse event, as a negative event? And I would say no, right? I think very often this is a very good thing. Same with screaming and so on, right? But there's a real balance there to say, how do we genuinely, put accountability on facilitators, also from a psychotherapeutic point of view, to say, know your contraindications. Know when your client, instead of experiencing something interesting, is actually dissociating or being re-traumatized, right? Know the parameters of, what can be psychologically helpful and what can be not so helpful, right? So be clearer on that, make this, less fuzzy. And at the same time, also from the current healthcare point of view, once we have given breathwork a real grounding and a real sort of, definition, where can we leave space for allowing unusual experiences, right? And also allowing, for example, the tuning in between facilitator and client, which is extremely hard to, you can't put that in a protocol, right? It's non-verbal, right? There's a lot of non-verbal components to breathwork. How can we leave space for those? I think as we're going forwards, obviously we do want this to become available to people, which also means that having it in the healthcare system would be amazing. And I think one of the most important points is hopefully that we can do this process while really listening to practitioners. Yes. I think that's also what you were saying. Practitioners know how, for example, difficult, challenging experiences can be really, really useful if they are navigated correctly. And so those kinds of things, when I see how the practice looks from the outside, I think there's a whole lot of things that, would be easier, would be like more comfortable to, standardize and to put in the protocol. But from a practitioner's point of view, we know that would actually be detrimental to the practice, yes. Right? Which is also what you sometimes see in psychedelic studies, that, some of the less controlled psychedelic studies have bigger effects. Right? And then the very controlled ones have smaller clinical effects. And then people say, oh, maybe that's because, this is a better controlled study. But I think sometimes it's because you're taking out the therapeutic things that are actually really helpful, the sort of less easy to quantify, less easy to verbalize parts, right? Yes. And one really interesting example of that recently was we had a survey, just a survey of people doing any type of breathwork, right? And one of the first impulses of sort of the psychotherapeutic context would be take touch out. Touch can be really difficult, can be boundary crossing. Let's just not touch, right? And what we saw in that survey is that actually when people do breathwork in the wild with the people who are currently practicing, touch is super helpful, mm-hmm. right? It's generally perceived as supportive. It makes sessions better and more, less likely to be harmful, more likely to be beneficial. And so those things, if we can listen to practitioners and to people who do breathwork right now, I think that'll make for much more interesting integration in the healthcare system.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the more communication there, the better. And I know Martin mm-hmm. McVilmy has a really lovely structured approach to conscious connected breathwork and ego inflation mm-hmm. and integration, and quite specific tests, mm-hmm. like breath hold tests that can be done that really make sure somebody has a window of tolerance to go. So I think the more people who are respiratory physiologists connect with people who are in the more, if you want to say, like energy spectrum of it, and everybody works together a lot more in communication, and then they connect in with you and every other researcher, of course. But this is really, really it's beautiful. It's beautiful work, and it's beautiful to see how it can then come into this because it's preventative healthcare. Like I truly do believe that. Like that's one of the reasons why I want to have this podcast as well, is like for people understanding how much control they have over their health with this really readily available tool. And you're not talking, of course there's some people who are hosting retreats that are very, very expensive, but you're not talking about like this insane amount of money. You're talking about something that will really, I always laugh when I say this, like knock the pharmacology a little bit. So maybe that would be an issue people might not need as much. But to me, that's the plus point of this, is that you're looking at like, what can this offer you that you can't get from a drug, and I think that's your studies really showing some really positive. Talk a little bit about this, about the indications that you've seen against like symptoms of depression and anxiety and the things that can shift using this practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, obviously there's more studies needed, but the first studies that, have been looking at the clinical effects of breathwork show very similar clues, like for example with psychedelic therapy, right? So definitely huge improvements with things like depression, anxiety, with post-traumatic stress. Also, it seems that, there's definitely some positive effects for people who are battling addiction, right? But also more positive sort of resources, kind of self-awareness, resilience, social relationships, the quality of your close relationships. All those things seem to have a huge potential to be improved by breathwork, right? So that's actually really exciting. And just like psychedelics, it's also amazing that, this is not like one thing you do for one specific, ailment or one specific goal, right? This is something that can do really good things for lots of different areas of your life, right? Including actually also physical health. Yeah. So I think that's really exciting. And what you were saying about, the breath is always yours, right, is I think also an incredibly important point. And we've seen that actually in people who have had psychedelic therapy and have had this feeling of like, oh, I'm never going to get back to this high, so to speak, right? And when you then realize, no, these states are in you and they're accessible to you, they're natural to you, right? And sure, there's different ways to open that door, and psychedelics is one, but it's not something that comes from the outside. No, I think that's an incredibly important experience to have, actually.
Yeah, Yeah, and that it can be on a daily, and I don't say that as like a, as a overhyped thing, like that you can create this state of awe within yourself on a daily. Like that's really why I try to share it. Like I was at the beach this morning, I get in the water and you have that feeling when you're plugged into nature and you're like connected to everything. Like speak to this. I know you really love speaking about connection to the universe, connection to nature, and that's why I share this work as well. I think like I've always been interested in protecting our environment, but you're plugged right in when you're in the breathwork field. Like you feel it, like it's 100%. So like speak to this in whatever direction that you like, because I know you've got interest there.
Yeah, I think that seems to be one of the things that breathwork really does. I think a lot of the ailments that we feel, especially right now in the West, right, in this particular phase of our cultural development, are essentially illnesses of disconnect. Right? So we know that with a lot of mental illnesses, for example, you can't feel your body, right? So people who are depressed or who have a lot of anxiety have a really hard time tracking their body, even things like, when is my heart beating, right? Those kinds of things, right? So that's the first disconnect, right? Having a very hard time feeling your body. That's something that breathwork changes very, very strongly. So that's actually also maybe something that's slightly different from psychedelics. Usually people report that when they do breathwork, a lot of the experiences they have are connected to their body or come up from their body, right? So connection with yourself, with your own feelings, with your own body, connection with others, right? Because, for example, I think for many people, especially when you do breathwork in a group, you realize, wow, there's so much shared humanity. We come into the circle and we all kind of think we're different, and maybe there's people you like, maybe there's people you don't like. And then you realize we all struggle with the same things, right? We struggle with trying to live loving lives, right? Trying to find a way to express ourselves freely, trying to, get rid of limitations that don't feel like they fit us, all those kind of things. So connection to others, I think, and then, as you mentioned, connection to the things that are bigger than us, which is another beautiful topic to show that science and spirituality don't at all fight each other, right? Because people thought that, experiences of, expansion and awe are something that you can never look at scientifically, but you can. And when you do that, for example, by having people draw their own figure after they've had an expansive experience, and usually people just draw themselves smaller, right? It's a very easy way to quantify, how much do you feel yourself in a bigger context. And when you do that, you see that it's actually something that's incredibly fundamental to our mental health. It's needed. It's not like a cute thing that we can have once in a while. Connection to something that's bigger than us is incredibly helpful to us as human beings, because I think we evolved as beings of connection. And again, that's something that breathwork can help us with, to, take off the filters and thereby realize our connection with the things that are bigger than us.
Yeah, that's it. It's like the true connection, and it's the joy you plug in. I always love that in a session where sometimes, like you said, somebody might be surprised they've gone in expecting like, oh, I want to let go, or they've brought their own intention that they think they're going to go into a difficult journey perhaps because of whatever it is they're experiencing, and then at the end they're like, I felt really happy. Like, oh, that was great.
Right,
like,
absolutely.
It's so good to just allow it to move through whatever it is. It's like you said, I think in your first page of your book, you're like, it's not breath fun, it's breath work. But sometimes it is breath fun. It's like a...
Yes, absolutely.
It moves between the two. As long as you do the work, it becomes breath fun. I think this is generally a pretty clear message.
Very much. And also what you said, that when you do breathwork more regularly, I definitely feel like you feel more touched by the world, right? By nature, by other people, right? It just, touches you more easily and more profoundly, and that gives such a beautiful depth to how we experience life, right?
Yeah, and it's, I love, is this something you would ever, have you ever looked at in any degree with being a neuroscientist, like the link between like the heart, brain? I love anything to do with, you start like measuring the actual like field of your heart. I think this is just like fascinating. Again, when you let people see the scientific lens on a little bit of what's known there. Of course, we can't measure all of the magical heart stuff this way.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I would have to think about that more. Because I don't think there's measurements right now, but I think there could be. So I think the only thing that we know is that, but this is on a very sensory level, right, is that in some people sort of both, for example, the breath and also just the heartbeat, right? So it always, you can always see it in the neural activity, right? So neural activity is always synchronized with your breath and with your heartbeat. But when your brain is registering your heart more directly, usually what also happens is that you have a clearer sense of self.
Yeah.
right? So just by feeling your body, by feeling your heart, people also report having a clearer sense of self, which is really interesting because it seems that the sense of self is not just in your brain, right? It's really the connection with your body and also really with your heart. So that's really interesting. But that's kind of, that's not exactly what you were. I don't think that's exactly what you were driving at, but that's kind of the closest
it's good
thing
to know
I
like
can
what you've experienced through it. I find it so fascinating. Like in a breathwork session, if somebody is anywhere even close to your heart field, as in a practitioner or a facilitator.
Right.
Anywhere close to it, like they're not touching it, they're maybe like 8 centimeters away, but you feel it, like you they're there without your eyes opening, and this is like anybody can feel this. Is not. I'm going to say woo woo again because people throw that out there so quickly. But actually, there's a great question I would love you to answer. Somebody who says to you, breath work is woo woo, like what is your answer? Because I've been asked this many times. This is the woo woo term, and then I love to go straight into the actual things that are happening in terms of baroreflex and all vagal tone and all these things, which of course can be measured. If you go to a chiropractor, they're measured, and like what is your balance, what is your tone between sympathetic and parasympathetic. What would be like your door opener to like let them explore it a little more?
Right. So I think that's an interesting one. I mean, obviously now we do have the data that we've talked about a little bit that show this is definitely a process that starts from physiology, right? It's not just kind of that you're sort of self-suggesting something or whatever, right? It's really something where physiology opens the door. But then I think also there's basically what neuroscience would tell you is actually kind of the opposite, right? So we've talked a little bit about the fact that, subconscious processing is actually, the vast majority of your processing, right? So if this cognitive verbal processing is actually just a very small part, right? So just neuroscientifically, it makes sense to look into the less verbal parts of your processing, right? Because that's where most things happen, right? That's this idea that, almost all choices we make are made subconsciously first, and then your conscious mind kind of finds a reason for why that's the correct thing to do, right? So I think in that sense, breathwork is a way to look at the less verbal parts, and that actually makes scientifically a whole lot of sense. And the same goes for generally altered states of consciousness. They are a natural mode of our brain because they happen in a lot of different contexts, and some contexts that are very common, like for example, childbirth, right? Women clearly go into a very different state of mind as they're giving birth to a child, right? Altered states of consciousness are a really fundamental part of how our brain works, constantly being verbal, rational, reasonable, rational, right? Like questionable, but verbal, reasonable is actually a small part of what our brain can do. And that's a very, very scientific fact. So exploring the other parts is actually a very logical thing to do.
That's a beautiful answer. I'm going to record this little snippet, and then anytime anybody asks me that question, be like, boom. I know I'm taking up so much of your time. You want to see how many questions I thought I was going to get to ask you. I could easily go.
Oh, that's lovely.
I could easily go for another hour, Talk to me a little bit then about like what the next sort of, I know you're up to so many things, the next few months, what is the focus? You're in the reset studies, that's still ongoing in process?
Yes, exactly. So I think there's basically two different directions that we really want to push. One is to look really sort of mechanically what happens in the brain when we have breathwork experiences, right? What are the mechanisms that allow us to have those experiences? What's important? What are the factors that make it easier or harder to have breathwork experiences? So that's really sort of basic science. And then the other part is to do more clinical research. Right now we're looking at the clinical effect of breathwork in trauma processing in a randomized controlled study. So those are the sort of, like really, really strict studies that can help us to, for example, bring healthcare into a more clinical context. And we're also going to try and expand that into different diagnoses, for example, depression and anxiety and so on, to really see both, what are the benefits of breathwork, certainly, but also to get a better safety profile, which I think is good to know for people who want to do breathwork and for facilitators, but it's also extremely important to get breathwork closer to the healthcare system to say, how often in, like, let's say 100 breathwork sessions do people have adverse effects, like, emotions they feel they can't handle, or, physical effects. Some people get a headache after breathwork, those kinds of things. So what really is the safety profile? How can we deliver this in a way that's really, really principled to limit negative effects as much as possible? I will say this part especially is very interesting, because already now, from the little data we have, it looks like breathwork is like super, super safe compared, for example, to antidepressants. Like, way safer, so much safer. So that's really promising, exactly. But yeah, so fleshing that out a little bit more.
Beautiful. We're so lucky. So I speak on behalf of the entire, like, anybody that's interested in breathwork and helping other people, but really lucky to have you and other researchers who are bringing this work forward. And for me, it's been really exciting to watch you, from like the first time I found you, to be like, amplifier voice. And, you've been amplifying your voice like on a global level now. So it's really, it's really, really lovely to see. You have your own training into the deep one. You predominantly work with training medical and psychotherapists, is that correct? It's open.
Well, so we have two things. So we have, yes, exactly. So it's an open training. So we sometimes have courses specifically for, medical health practitioners, for example, with specific clinics and so on. But we also definitely do open trainings. And the next one starts end of April. So if somebody feels called, they can get in touch with us.
Excellent. And final question, because I just like to always know this. What is your favorite breathing technique, like most frequently used outside of conscious connected breathwork or circular breathwork?
Yes. So for me, it's actually circular sighing.
You like the circles?
Like, I do that. Exactly. Exactly. The rounder the better. So yes, it was part of this little paper by the Huberman Lab, a really lovely paper where they compared meditation with a couple of different breathing techniques, and this was kind of the most effective one. And it's only 5 minutes a day, and so I was just like, oh well, cool paper, let's try it. And then I really found it both relaxing and energizing. So it's really simple. So you kind of do like with the nose, and so you basically sigh, right? Big in, little bit more in, and then, and you just do that for 5 minutes, and I find that a lovely way to start the day.
Yes, it's a beautiful one. It balances like O2, CO2. I always like it as a little shamanic breath too, right? It's like a little, I always like this as an opener in a session. If you do a little, then your heart feels very connected very quickly.
That's right, exactly. That's how it feels to me too. Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for coming on. I'll maybe bother you again in the future to see what's going on. I love every year in the Spirit of Breath Collective training. I'm like, what are you adding on? It's always good, and I could talk to you for hours. But I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. Love our conversation.
Mwah. You take care, honey.
Lovely. Yes, you too. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thanks for listening to the Wave Breathwork Podcast. If this episode supported your nervous system or expanded how you think about breath and consciousness, you can explore more at Wave Breathwork. Take care. Slán agus Bannacht.